You've recently been on St Kilda, which is a fascinating place. And how did you find that experience from a photographic point of view?
I think it actually goes right back to when I started photography, because St Kilda is somewhere which, again, there must be a couple of hundred books written about it. It's so heavily documented, and there are a number of photography books on St Kilda, but they're all of the kind of pictures of puffins and kind of the ruins of the abandoned community there in Village Bay. But it's something that I felt that didn't quite live up to the reality of the place, because growing up, my father had friends who were posted there. My father was in a regiment which did drone warfare during the Cold War, and I kind of had this image of St Kilda which was quite separate from the kind of infamous 1930 evacuation where the entire community left Herta. I actually knew that St Kilda was a modern military base which is used to track the most high-tech UK weaponry fired from Benbecula, and it was my father's regiment that actually sent people out there. So I wanted to go out there and kind of try to mentally kind of find out how those two worlds coexisted, how you had this UNESCO, actually dual UNESCO World Heritage Site with these ruins, and then you had radar tracking stations, aerials, combat equipment, how those kind of how those two communities, or a community and a lack of or an absence of a community, how they visually work together. So that was kind of the impetus behind that project, was to go out there and see for myself.
What sort of conclusions have you reached having completed your book, and your book is now published? What conclusions did you come to?
Well, it just kind of strengthens the impression that when we look at the land, it's, we spend a lot of time emptying our gaze, I think is the kind of phrase that's used, of people, of the connections that have been formed there. And with St Kilda, it's such a complicated place. There's all these kind of half-truths and legends about, the army landed there after the war and planned to, grind the village into dust to build their base. And in fact, it was the MOD that, helped save the island in many ways, because their constant transport out there, taking troops and taking equipment out there has helped pave the way for tourism. But then it's tourism which may destroy the island, so it's, and at the same time, it's hard to sort of praise the military too much, because at the same time as that they're widening access to the island, they're also using it to test, these weapons of war, which are, causing quite a lot of misery. So it's quite, it's a really complex place. So again, it's sort of strengthened the impression I have that Scotland, or kind of anywhere in the UK, especially which has a military occupation, or somewhere which is a place of high tourism, it has all these different layers of history which kind of sit together, and quite often uncomfortably. And St Kilda is one of those places which is very kind of uncomfortable. So hopefully the book shows some of the tensions there.
Another, Castle Martin is a huge tank range and training area for soldiers in Pembrokeshire, and I was really wondering how I should go about photographing that area, and it's and I've done it. I kind of done it in one shot, really. There's outside the base. There's this tank on a kind of and it's on sort of it's pointing upwards anyway. But there's this wonderful sign that says "Stop" in front of it, and I kind of and there's a church in the background, and you think, well, it kind of sums it all up. And then, but there's a poet called Walter Williams who wrote about birds returning to the area because the birds had disappeared, and so I've added that as part of the testimony to what I think Castle Martin is, because it's one of those difficult things, isn't it? You kind of. And I don't know about you, but I like layers in photographs as well. and they say different things, don't they? You know, and that sort of storytelling element of that is part and parcel of being a photographer, I suppose.
I know very much so. I mean, what you're saying, I think my brother was a Royal Marine. I think he was actually stationed there at one point.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, again, it's something that I was continually aware of. When I moved to Scotland, we moved to this town called Irvine on the Ayrshire coast, and later I'd actually have a studio down there. But growing up, I thought, you know, my dad left the military, and I thought, you know, that's us kind of done with the kind of military side of things. But every Wednesday morning in this town, you'd hear the ominous sound of air raid sirens, you know, starting up every morning on every Wednesday morning. And it was from a place called the Ardeer, which is a former, well, in fact, it's currently still used by the MOD to create weapons. And I was always drawn to that place. Growing up, we actually used to go and play on the outskirts of it because it was a town during the Second World War that had about 13,000 workers in it. And now the core of it is still a military installation, but the outside of it, there are countless bunkers and railways and old hospitals and power stations. And, you know, for a kid, you know, playing, that was fantastic, you know. But it's now been given over to roe deer and, you know, the other Scottish fixation, they might turn it into a golf course, you know. So it's funny that way, you know. But yeah, I think with photography, you can visit those places and you can look at the different layers that are in the land. So again, I've tried to capture that as well in terms of, you know, some of the wildlife that's returned there. Or, you know, like Mark Wilson, for example, his work with bunkers on the French coast or just around just around Europe. I mean, those are great images for showing the kind of, again, the complexity of the human story from defence through to memorial through to, you know, they're quite elegiac, you know, they're and trying to capture that's such a difficult thing, and the way that he's done that is something, you know, I've always thought was quite admirable. So
that's another interesting aspect as well, because Pembrokeshire was regarded at one time as being the Preseli Mountains. They wanted to take over the whole of the Preseli Mountains to bomb the hell out of it, you know. But local people stood up to them, you know, and they won. And they beat the Ministry of Defence, you know, and the government at the time. Yeah, and those kind of heroes are neglected. I mean, and you know, those hills. I mean, they're not. I mean, they're just hills. You know, they're nothing compared to what you have up in Scotland. But there's a special feel about them, you know. It's the gorse and it's the rolling nature of them and the things you find and the rocks you see, you know, because they're all grey but they've got these wonderful lichen all over them, you know. And a fascinating place and endless adventuring up there, you know, wandering from place to place. And those are the kind of things that appeal to me. The last time I was in Scotland was a long, long time ago. It was about 1982 was my last venture to Scotland, and I went to Skye, and I took a young lady with me to Skye, and we had a fabulous time. But all I remember was like a moonscape, and I didn't photograph it. You know, I wasn't really a photographer at the time. I would carry a camera around, but I'd only take the odd shot here and there. Those sort of things, and I will return one day up there, I think, and have a look around, you know. But going back to what Rob Hudson said to you, who is part of your group, and he said stay in one place. But I get the kind of feeling that you're not that type of guy, are you? Really?
I think I've tried to be, but it hasn't quite worked out. I mean, when you hear my voice, I don't have the accent of someone who grew up in this area, for example, although I spent a lot of my life here. I don't know, I feel quite nomadic, but that don't think it bothers me so much. But there are places I'm continually drawn back to. But yeah, I don't know, I'm endlessly curious about things, so I can't see myself, you know, stopping to travel. But
are you curious about people? I mean, I've got your website up here at the moment. And there's this wonderful shot of this lady in her dressing gown, and I think that's just Absolutely fabulous.
Yes.
I mean, did you just come across her, Alex?
No, definitely not. So I did all the collodion stuff for a number of years, and I kind of got to that point as well where kind of people, if they knew me for anything, previously it had been about making a man stand in the landscape, and then latterly it became about dragging very heavy cameras around the landscape and using chemicals. So I try to work out what are the things that scare me the most kind of as a photographer, and for me I worked out that was portraiture. So
Right.
I wrote to a publisher in the Faroe Islands and said, you know, I've always been interested in the Faroes. It's somewhere that I've never been to, but I'd love to come up and photograph the people who live there, and just meet people who are all over the island, and kind of document them in their day-to-day lives. So again, that was the start. The great campaign machine started in my head, and I got dates to go out there for a month, and I started researching who lived there, and you know, who were kind of the prominent artists, and who were the musicians, and who were kind of some of the interesting figures. And that woman, she's in her 90s now, and she goes sea swimming every day. And her name's Maria Haigam, I think her surname is pronounced. But her grandson made a film about her called Maria and the Waves, and I watched this film and was completely spellbound. And when I was in the Faroes, I was very well looked after by a family there, and I just brought up her name in conversation, and they went, "Oh, she just lives, you know, along the street there. Why don't you go and see her?" And yeah, I just went along and photographed her doing her daily swim, and
And the wonderful Trondur Patterson with his sculpture. I mean, he's wild. Wow, what a man!
Yeah, he's amazing. He was part of Tim Severin's Brendan Voyage. I don't know if you've ever seen the film about that, but well, he was the Faroese guy who was spearfishing, but he's as amazing in real life as you could imagine. Quite controversial figure. When I was out there, there's a lot of conversation around the hunting of whales, the grint, and he's an advocate of that, and he is very much a man of the sea and a man of art, and kind of finding those tensions or overlaps was really interesting. He's such a great person to photograph. He's just instantly recognizable. You know, I happily spend a couple of days photographing him.
And I guess photographic opportunities around every corner, I would imagine, Alex.
It's interesting because the Faroe Islands are now kind of at that point where they're going full Iceland, and in terms of that, I mean, Iceland, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago was somewhere that people were starting to turn their attention towards photographically, and now it's not exhausted, but there are certain tropes, there are certain things you see constantly. Well, the Faroe Islands now has kind of gone that way as well. There's endless photographic workshops, which kind of, you know, I'm kind of two minds on photographic workshops. I think some which, I lived on the Outer Hebrides for 2 years. I mean, you saw them like packs, you know, traveling around. Ones which teach people to, you know, express themselves or to photograph certain, you know, ways of photographing or ways of developing your eye. Those are great, but quite often they just seem like safaris. And you know, I've seen so many exhibitions now of people going to the Faroes and not really discovering it. They're discovering it through the eyes of other people.
Yes.
So yeah, for me visually the Faroes was good because the first time I went, I actually travelled around the islands in a 100-year-old fishing boat, which gave me a kind of a different perspective. And then latterly, I embedded myself there for quite a while. So I spent quite a few months there, and I just tried to sort of ignore other images and just find them for myself. Which I think that's becoming increasingly hard with somewhere like that, in the way that, say, the Scottish Highlands as well. It's quite, you know, finding a place which perhaps hasn't been seen through someone else's eyes.
I mean, it was exactly the same problem I had with my Pembrokeshire project. Really, was avoiding the cliche. I mean, I could probably have photographed one bit of sea endlessly because the change in weather and cloud formation and storms and the way the waves worked. It's kind of, I suppose it's a way, I think probably, and I don't know if you agree with me, you're using the lens of the camera to fire your imagination, really, I think. And certainly it does for me. I mean, I try and look at things in an imaginative way, or I suppose you can mess around with photographs endlessly, you know, but I wanted to ask you, actually, how much sort of post-production do you do on your images? Do you do a lot, or is it sort of or what's on the film or what's in the camera is what we get?
Well, I worked as a museum photographer actually at one stage, and you know the idea is that you get most of it in the back of the camera at the time. Now, my own approach, I really don't. Actually, I'm not that well equipped with, say, Photoshop or anything like that in terms of my skills at it aren't great. So actually, that's a kind of a deliberate act so that I can't really mess around with images too much. But I try to get things sort of not as I see them, but I kind of get to the point where I want to see them. Now, previously I worked with, I've gone out and made images on Sky, for example, and I know what I wanted them to be. I knew what the aesthetic was that I was looking for. So I actually did a series of collodion works on Sky, and I wrote to a friend of mine who's an advertising photographer. He was actually one of the kind of madmen of the 70s. He was actually there during that whole scene, and he was great because I sent him the scans of the tintypes. And I'd also send him sketches of what I was looking for, along with some photographic reference points, and he'd then edit the images in the way that I wanted them. So, for example, he would remove mountain ranges, or he would, you know, crush mountains or elevate them, and we'd create these new synthetic fake landscapes. And then I exhibited those at the Royal Scottish Academy, and you know, people just looked at them and went, they're just, you know, yet again another collodion landscape or whatever, you know, but they didn't realize that what they're looking for were completely synthetic landscapes. They couldn't get past the aesthetic of collodion. But other than that kind of project where I actually deliberately set out to manipulate the audience as well as the images, I don't actually tend to mess around with them just too much. But then I have absolutely no problem with people doing whatever the hell they want with the images. I think purism in photography, I think purism in anything is the death of art. You know. So yeah.
I mean, out of interest, do you before going out on location, do you think about weather, and do you think about what it's likely to be like when you go to these places?
Well, with the collodion stuff, I mean, you definitely need to plan in advance. So they use UV light to make exposures. So, for example, the ones on Sky up on the Cullen, or the ones which are up on the Store. Yeah, I mean, I'd be looking for a break in the weather where I could take the stuff up there, because it's quite arduous taking stuff up there. I'd need enough sunlight to actually develop and process the images on the hill. And you know, when it comes to things like skies, collodion doesn't actually have, you know, I mean, sometimes you can get cloud detail, but you don't really get dramatic skies. I mean, you think of all those images of the Wild West, which just have clear skies. It's because they overexpose because of the long exposures. They just burn out. So when I was making collodion images at that stage, I would look for really sunny days where I could work with really short exposures, where I could actually just plan to get up a hill and either bury the stuff up there and return the next day, or I would be able to get up first thing in the morning, make, and then take down. And then things like the drama in a lot of those images are actually me working with chemicals straight onto the plate. I knew before I went anywhere I'd go and tend to scope it out first to see how easy it was to get there. I'd time myself. I would then try and work out how much water I needed. So the whole thing became, you know, a logistical exercise, which sounds probably like the antithesis of art. But I just had I would have a strong image in my head of what I wanted to make, and then I would just work back from that. How do I make that happen? So there's an image there which is Loch Ishort, I think, and it's three islands. Now those three islands, that is actually one island at high tide, and that's just the top of it, and that's a very minimal image. Taken on a normal day, behind that image there's the Cullen mountain range, but it's actually obscured in low-level fog. So for that image, I needed a day where the cloud was really low, when it was high tide, but where there was enough light to actually make that image, and also needed to work out when it was dry enough, because I needed to drag all the gear to that cliff edge to make that image. So you've got to, there's all these kind of factors that I need to kind of think about before I even make the image. So it's with collodion, it's such a slow process that you need to be, methodical about it.
Yes. Way. What's your? Are you working on film now, Alex, or are you? Have you stepped into the digital world?
Well, I think that's a misconception with what I do, because I've always kind of had a foot in both. I think because the kind of the collodion stuff has really been at the forefront. I've shot digital as soon as I could get a digital camera. So for example, the Faroese project, I actually shot it in tandem. I was working with a Mamiya 7, so shooting medium format. At the same time, I was also using a Nikon D800 or something, and because it allows me to, to work in different ways. But my kind of average day pack when I'm hiking would tend to have a digital camera, a decent SLR, but I would also have like a Hasselblad 500, CM or something, and I would have it so that the lenses from the Hasselblad could work on the Nikon. So I try to keep my kit kind of working between the two. So I've always had this kind of dual approach. But because I work so slowly, I don't do action photography. It doesn't really matter, So I still shoot a hell of a lot of film. But the one thing I'm doing a lot these days is trying to shoot less, kind of trying to focus down and to what I actually think is important. And so that's the most important thing at the moment, is less shots but more important ones.
I've become very minimalist, and I shoot with a little Fuji now, and I have 3 lenses in my bag, and because I'm getting old and carrying stuff around is really, you're carrying heavy DSLRs around. So I enjoy that minimalist approach. You worked with Takeshi Ishikama. What did he bring to the table that inspired you?
Yeah, I spent a couple of months on Sky. Takeshi and I shared a studio, and I spent a lot of time with him and his wife Yukiko, and we would just he had a really interesting approach where he arrived on Sky, but he did not want to see any other photographic depictions of Sky. He had gone out of his way not to see any pictures of the island, as much as was, possible. And he asked for me to take him around. So we spent a lot of time together. He does have some English, but not a great deal. And it's mainly his wife Yukiko who would go between Japanese and English. So we'd go to like say Rase or some of the smaller parts of Skye, and we would just get out of the car, and then there'd be no comment passed. We'd walk in silence for a lot of it, and then sometimes he would look at an image and then shake his head and look at me and go, "Michael Kenna," So I knew not to take that picture because he didn't want to be too Michael Kenna about it. But he had a very stripped down aesthetic, which taught me to take less images but to look more. And there'd be days where I'd go out with him and he was carrying a Linhof camera with him. And he's such an interesting photographer because he's beaten stomach cancer and he's now in his 70s and he's still out there on the hills. And it's really, one thing I got from him was energy and focus, and to try and put a lot of the inessential things to the side. One thing he does have is an insane amount of drive, and some of those kind of I'd say sort of Japanese approaches in terms of the kind of the minimal language that's developed in Japanese photography in the kind of post-war period in a lot of photographers. He was very much a fan of that. So he, when he looked through my work and I'd look through his work, there'd be kind of really interesting dialogues where, you know, he'd tell me what he thought was successful and what wasn't successful. And I think for a while there I was quite influenced by his approach, and I think you can see that in some of the collodion works, the kind of later ones. The one I mentioned with the three islands, that's very much kind of has a Japanese aesthetic. Or there's an image.
Was that? Yeah. Was that a raw process? Him going through your images and casting his critical eye over them.
I think it can be. It depends how egotistical you are. I was quite lucky. A couple of years ago, I had a really great portfolio session with someone, and I walked out of it going, "Well, that's what they think," you know, kind of thing. And it took some time. I tried to work out why I was so annoyed, and the annoying thing was, John from Source magazine, I think it was at the time. I was like, "Damn, he's right." It's like, if I continue down this path of carrying heavy cameras and taking blacker than black shots, I'm going to turn into kind of the Thomas Joshua Cooper of collodion or something, you know. So that's when I kind of realised that you can't have too thick a skin. And then when Takeshi, someone who I really respect as a photographer, his body of work, The Silent Respiration of Forests, is just, you know, it's wonderful. I just kind of sat back because, you know, he's someone who I have a lot of time for and a lot of respect for, and, you know, you kind of have to sort of leave your ego outside that and, you know, not feel stung. But you've also got to kind of hold on to something. You're not there to impress him. You're not there to, you know, you've got to stick to your guns, as it were, but you've got to be able to take another person's opinion on board, you know. So yeah, it was an experience.
As far as your new project, the one that you're sort of getting fit for, can you tell us a little about that and what you hope to achieve with that project?
Yeah, so that actually, in a strange way, that project really started when I was on Sky and working with Takeshi. I, at that time, was very interested in sort of Japanese ideas and conceptions of landscape, and I came across a book called 100 Mountains of Japan, which was written by Kyu Fukada, and this book is kind of the complete antithesis of mountain writing, in the respect that he made a list of 100 mountains. We all know lists, you know, Munros and Corbetts and all that sort of thing. But he wrote a list of 100 mountains which were culturally significant, or, you know, they were related to Genji or Basho or any of these poets, or they were related to, you know, not just his experiences, but they were, you know, visually graceful, or they were, you know, they had a beauty that was kind of past, you know, being, you know, 3,333 feet high or whatever. That book is, I mean, I got that book about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, and it's something that's always been sort of on my bedside table. And I was very lucky. I got a Daiwa grant, the Daiwa Japanese British Foundation, to go to Japan, to actually go and walk and photograph amongst those mountains that he wrote about. And that experience will feed directly into this project, which is to do a series on the Scottish landscape. It's a series of very minimal black and white works, but also, you know, a book which is going to be a couple 100 pages long, which will focus on these mountains which are important to Scottish culture and literature and language. So like you talked about in the kind of Welsh experience, there's a mountain here called Ben Dorain, which is famous for the bardic poetry of Duncan Ban MacIntyre. He wrote about it and the loss of the communities at the base of it during the clearances. And there's also, you know, there's mountains like Sullivan, which is this absolutely beautiful peak which rises, you know, up in Sutherland. So I'm working on this project over the summer, so I'll be climbing these mountains and documenting them as I go. So yeah, it's
fantastic. Yeah, I mean, you know, the Preseli Mountains, Preseli Hills. I mean, dozens of bits of poetry written about those hills, because they were and are part of the Mabinogion, which is there are several stories about stories written. Well, they were talked before they were written, and they were written in the 1200s. But they are and they're mythical stories about Arthur and Olwen, who left trails of flowers after extraordinary stories, and one of them was hunting a wild boar over the mountains of the Preseli, and there is and Arthur's grave is on the top of the Preseli mountains, so it's and all these cairns and things they're ingrained in us somehow, and they become they hold us together. And I think they hold us together as a nation in Wales as well, and they're really, really important culturally.
Oh, I'd say so. Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar here. When Ffoton wrote his book, he said, that Japan was a nation of mountain lovers, but I can see that in Wales, which is a country that to my great embarrassment, have actually never been to. I've been to St Kilda, I don't know how many times, but I've never made it to Wales. But Scotland is similar, I think, in terms of, when I grew up, the mountains of Arran were omnipresent. You couldn't get away from them. They're just always on the horizon. And in Glasgow, or Edinburgh, you can see the mountains from there. So they've kind of always, mountains and hills have always been part of that kind of visual narrative. And like yourself, we have the stories of Cuchulainn, and it goes all the way back to those kind of great early myths, right through to the poetry of Norman MacCaig and Assynt, or Sorley MacLean. I mean, on Skye you can't really separate the kind of Gaelic poetry of MacLean from the Cuchulainn itself, so it's the kind of the way that language and landscape work together like that is something which really will inform my approach visually as well. So I feel that I've got to a stage now where I know what I want to create image-wise, but now I also want to supplement that with text as well in quite a major way. Photography, if it's done one thing for me, is it's really fired up my drive to write more, because there's only, I think there are limits to what you can say with an image potentially.
Yes.
So I found that photography has been a great vehicle for inspiring other forms of expression for me. So yeah.
Right. So in what way will you express yourself in prose, Alex?
Well, with this book, there will be say it's going to be 250 pages. I'll look at each of these mountains and talk about their kind of cultural significance, but also recount some of my own memories and experiences. It's been great reading Ffoton because he has this very minimal but incredibly expressive form of writing, which it's quite moving at times, where there's a lot of omission actually, and the things he doesn't talk about, they can be. So for example, one mountain he climbed it, and unfortunately his climbing partner and friend actually fell to his death on that mountain. But as he recounts the story of the mountain and its importance, he doesn't talk about that at all, because he doesn't want the reader to somehow have this negative view of this thing that that his personal experience is less important than the importance culturally and spiritually of that place. So I mean, at the moment I'm reading a lot of writers like Alistair McIntosh, or people who've written about, I'm not a spiritual person per se, but I'm quite interested in how people view these things as, like yourself, places to return to, or the importance that they hold for communities. So when we talk about prose, I don't know, I'm still kind of trying to work that out. I'm just writing as much as I can.
Right, so are you a note taker when you're out and about?
I'm not really a note taker. I am a sketch pad taker. I do a lot of sketching and drawing. so one of the most important parts of this project, before I even go and climb some of these things or go and be amongst them, is I started to use pen and ink to really start drawing them and try to understand the form of the thing. So there's a lot of kind of field studies. So next week I'm going to go over to Arran, for example, those mountains which I can, draw with my eyes closed, but go and actually sit and draw and sketch and, try and see how those things might feed then into my photography, but also into my writing. So yeah, I'm trying to go for different approaches and see how they feed. Right. I mean, all of these things feed back and feed into each other,
So are you a frustrated maker of paintings and sketches? Do you think you will ever go down that route professionally, or to feed your mind?
I don't know where it'll go. I really enjoyed watching the Faye Godwin film Don't Fence Me In recently, which has her painting into some of her images and cutting them up and making collages, and I think all of that is to the good. Sometimes I'll try and listen to music when I'm walking, which might be not really what I'd be into, to see if that would try and take my mind into a different place, visually speaking. But in terms of being a frustrated visual artist, I don't know. I think I'm very clear on the aesthetic that I want to pursue at the moment, and at least mentally I'm very kind of clear on that. And I think working in painting, no, I do not want to become a painter. No, I don't want to become an etcher, but I know that I do things like photogravure, for example.
Yes.
And I know that, I'm starting to score and mark into plates. So that kind of hybrid of photography and painting is already kind of happening. When I lived on Lewis, for example, I did a whole series of printing onto this kind of blood red or ochre red peat ash, which you had these kind of stark black and white images printed onto. And I love that kind of that ochre with blacks, which is something that's quite often you see that in Japanese Japanese painting, but quite often the red is minimal and it's often just the signature. So it's something that I'm always trying to kind of play with in my work, is the painterly and the photographic, and where those two kind of come together.
It's a bit wabi-sabi, really, isn't it? Alex? But I love it. That's. There's one beach in Pembrokeshire which I'm besotted by. I can't get away from it at all. It's called Druidston Beach, and I go there all the time. And every time I go, it's different, and it's a lively place and a colourful place and a dark place. It's all those things, and it's just the simple things, It's like I've done one set about a waterfall there. It's not much of a waterfall really, but I went there when it was absolutely blowing a gale, and but the water was being thrown everywhere, and it was bouncing off the rocks and stuff. And I spent hours just photographing what was happening, and it kind of there's a meditative feel to these things, isn't there? It's not just photography, is it? It takes you to different places, and the wonder of it all, really, and the way that it's never repeated, and those things appeal to me greatly.
Yeah, I think it's cheaper than therapy, isn't it? But yeah, I can understand that. Again, just finding a place and being within it. I try to sort of force myself, I don't know, to maybe not take images in those places, but, like all rules, you tend to break them yourself. So, it's interesting what you're saying about, things which are perhaps not much of a waterfall. Or beaches which perhaps are not, so for example on Harris, Luscantyre Beach is the beach to photograph. And I've often struggled with that, and I think that's from really my first kind of exposure to photography. looking at those kind of huge Ansel Adams landscapes and thinking, you can't photograph these huge things. You're not one of the, the F-64 photographers. You're not one of the trailblazing photographers of the West. It's all been done, that kind of grand stuff. You've got to move to the small and to the macro. But I kind of went with that for a while, and I started off taking big landscapes and then tried to move into smaller stuff, and then I find myself going back to the bigger narratives. But I look at the large landscapes now, but more at the social and historical things going on within them. I think that's because kind of as I've got older, I've got more interested in things like conservation and land usage, and I'm about to start a doctorate actually in October, which looks at those those exact subjects, land usage and history and trauma in landscape photography. So so those are the themes which really interest me.
Producing your books, I mean, do you self-publish, or are you commissioned, or is it a labor of love?
No, I've worked with publishers so far. At the moment, I'm working with Lua, who just published the book on St Kilda, and they've worked with some of my favourite poets, Scottish poets, and they've worked with photographers like Robin Galanders, who was quite important to me when I was growing up. And the Faroese book is being published by a Faroese publisher, and the next couple of books, again, they're all done by publishers. I think that the kind of revolution in self-publishing has been amazing, and then seeing, I mean, there's so many great kind of little publishers out there. I mean, I would always look at something like Another Place Press, for example, Ian Sargent's publisher.
Yes, indeed.
I mean, I'm sitting with a copy of Black Dots on my table just now, which was the one to do with Scottish Bothies by Nicholas White, I think it was. And,
yes, I know the one, yeah.
And I think those kind of ways forward are just fantastic. Photographers actually producing the books they want to read, And I mean, I look at my library of kind of photographic books, and there's so many, friends and people I know who've, produced stuff on Blurb. And it's, I think for some of the kind of more esoteric stuff that I've kind of done on the side, or that I'd want to do in future, I definitely would look to do it that way, because I know it might be a bit more niche. But at the moment now, given that my kind of time investment, I'd rather go with a publisher who's established and let them do the kind of dissemination work. So that's kind of my approach these days. But it might change. I don't know. I think it's just great to have the sheer amount of voices out there now, and it's such a great and vibrant time.
So when are you going to come to Wales, Alex?
Well, I don't know. I think I'd quite like to come down in the next year or two, because with this PhD, I really want to see. I mean, I'll be looking at how Celtic people have had their landscapes documented, and how they documented them themselves. So going to Wales, obviously, you're like our brothers and sisters down there. So yeah, it's on the cards for sure. So.